Hi, I'm Mike Parker from Mining Footprint, and I'm joined by Jake Erickson, our international relations practitioner. We're just going to continue our discussions about how, in our view, international relations theory is so important when it comes to understanding complex problems such as occur in the mining industry. And we've already had some small discussions in Toronto where we talked about social constructs and how those things might fit into the way that international relations theories interleaf with mining projects. This video will be one of a series of 7, and today we're going to initiate that study with a discussion about realism. Hi Jake, how are you doing?
Good, how are you, Mike?
I'm very well, thanks. Why do we think that international relations theories are so important and applicable to the mining industry?
You have environmental issues, you have government, state, local issues, you have geological, science-based problems, and when you have this confluence of factors that impact industry operations, you need a perspective that is able to account for all of them in order to either understand a problem, figure out a solution, or be able to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. So international relations theory is a tool that's frequently used to understand all sorts of complex mitigating factors like the ones that were just mentioned. So by using that in the mining context, we can have a better approach that fully accounts for this complex nature of interwoven issues to come out with solutions that more adequately address the problems we're trying to confront.
And as you mentioned there, Jake, international relations theories are quite good at understanding and delving into quite complex problems to understand what may be the origin of those problems and even in some manner predict what may be some form of solution. But as the world has become more complex and other factors have become much more prevalent, such as the environmental impacts and also the social impacts, we've seen that the mining world has moved towards a much more complex issue called social license, where they have to obtain various permissions and agreements and understandings, and they have to attain certain levels of excellence to be able to operate in the jurisdictions they operate. And in international relations, we've seen that sort of evolution of theories has happened in a similar fashion. But let's just talk a little bit about the theory that we're going to focus on today, which is realism, which I believe was initially one of the original theories of international relations.
So broadly speaking, in the international relations world, we'll divide roughly between a traditional and more contemporary approach or understanding of theory. There's a traditional era when theory was just first coming out of the framework, and then there was the contemporary era where new theories were developed to try to account for actors that traditional theories might not have given consideration to or didn't fully understand. And you mentioned, obviously, realism, Mike. So realism was one of the very first theories of international relations that was born out of an observation that states seem to be the primary actors at the international level. To summarize sort of the beginnings of international relations theory, it was really born from a World War I, World War II international environment where we saw a lot of key trends at the time, namely that states seemed to be the primary actors at the international level. To fully understand and explain the behaviors that states were engaging in at the time, which really seemed to revolve around security interests, realism was formed to try to account for that, which essentially argued that states are the primary actors at the international level and their primary concern is survival.
Okay, so realism deals with states and things inside the states, such as government, such as protests, such as political movements. They don't feature at all in the international relations theory of realism.
In realism, there's a term called the black box of the state, right? And it implies that whatever happens within the box is completely unknown to us. All that is known is that states are constantly trying to maximize their survival. And they do that by pursuing what we call national self-interest, or the interests of the state encapsulating the rights and hopes and desires of the people within it. So if a state actor behaves in an X, Y, Z manner, then it's assumed that X, Y, and Z in some way, shape, or form maximizes the state's interest and ultimately its survival. Now, whether or not actors behave rationally, whether or not actors can make a totally absurd decision, isn't something that's well accounted for in realism, right? Because the assumption is that regardless of what the state is doing, the end result will be maximizing its self-interest and ultimately its survival.
Okay, so this is what some people term offensive realism, where the states just maximize their self-interest by establishing their strengths in a competition in a world that's got very little control, very little. It's a sort of anarchic situation. They basically just impose themselves on that situation to further their self-interest.
Well, you mentioned an anarchic situation, right? So the assumption, and keep in mind this was at the end of World War I when you had new states coming out of the framework. It did seem like there was a real absence of international institutions to fully absorb or account for their behaviors.
So when you have an environment where states are competing against one another,
realists described it as anarchic to say that there doesn't seem to be anything regulating states' behavior apart from that state's own desire to survive. So offensive realism refers to this concept where states are solely pursuing their maximal interest at the expense of their enemies and other states that they happen to be competing with. States competing against each other ultimately find an equilibrium, right? A balance of power between separate interests. So some realists might actually argue that the Cold War era, for instance, was a really stable time in world history because you had East versus West, and no one power was greater than the other. And that allowed some form of stability in a system that is otherwise anarchic.
Now, it's interesting to see if this realism, this establishment of this scramble for new territories, which in 200 years ago was a effective colonization, if any of that was related to resources and to natural resources. I'm just thinking in terms of the Spanish conquest of Central and Latin America, which was driven by a desire for gold and silver to basically monetize the Spanish Empire at that stage. And then at a much later stage, we had the example of the British South Africa Company of Cecil John Rhodes that went north into Central Africa in the context of exploration, in the context of obtaining wealth from minerals that would then enable the same area to be colonized for the benefit of Great Britain. And in fact, that company had a royal charter which authorized it to do that. How typical is that of realism in this context?
The benefit of using international relations theory, especially in situations like this, is that you can use the theory to underscore, explain those sort of behaviors, right? So in the examples that you mentioned, one was Cecil John Rhodes and using a royal charter. Even though this is a single individual conducting diplomacy on behalf of what are supposed to be business or mining interests, ultimately they have the state's approval to do so. Thus, that individual who's conducting the royal charter or engaging in this sort of treaty-making process is ultimately doing so on behalf of the state. So that fits in perfectly with the realism framework that when a state is pursuing its self-interest, it does so in a variety of ways, whether it be at the security level or maximizing its economic interests. The same could be true of the colonial example that you provided in Latin America. Both examples, I think, could, from a realist perspective, could fit in nicely with the theory, so long as you frame it around the idea that this was done on behalf of the state. There's some people who might disagree with it, but that's the beauty of the theory, is that it's only one way of understanding it. There's no reason why you can't use other theories to underscore it. So one example might be defensive realism, which is a slightly different field in the realism spectrum, where defensive realists might argue that institutions can come about so long as they go along with that original principle of maximizing the state security interests. In this case, having colonial holdings that sort of augment the national resources of the state to let it better prepare for security scenarios might fit very well under a realist perspective, where the primary goal is the state's survival.
Interesting that you mentioned this defensive realism, where various countries aggregate themselves to institutions such as the European Union, which obviously this union gives them a huge benefit in economic terms, in political terms. As a bloc, they're much more powerful on the world stage. They basically had free borders and free movement of labor, which gave them a huge competitive advantage as a big bloc of countries. But recently we've seen with the coronavirus outbreak that those borders were closed, and those countries entered into a competition for resources such as pharmaceutical products, such as medical staff, such as technology to overcome the crisis. And it's really interesting how that defensive realism has quickly been converted into a more offensive realism. It's gone retrograde, it's gone backwards in times of a crisis. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Point to something like the COVID-19 crisis, right? And suddenly European states, which are part of the European Union, suddenly competing neck and neck for key resources like for personal protective equipment or gear for their respective staffers in the hospitals. When you have a situation, an institution like the EU, which by design requires some buy-in from all of its members or cooperation, a defensive realist scenario where the institution upholds it suddenly does seem a little bit shakeable.
Defensive realism and traditional realism, and very clear state-centric. It's all related to the way countries interrelate and the countries that further their own interests. And people may be asking, well, has that got anything to do with modern mining? And I think the answer to that is, in our experience, we might be seeing some traces or some echoes of realism. Often in major mining projects, the company that goes to work in jurisdictions would affiliate itself with its home country embassy, whether that be Canada, United States, or Great Britain. And they seem to want to cloak themselves in some sort of nationality, so that they seem to want to project themselves and their interests in that form of nationality, which I think may be an echo of realism. And obviously the commercial functions and the commercial attaches in those embassies have a great interest in making sure that those companies succeed, because it's in the interest of that country if their own companies succeed. And the other thing that happens sometimes is that companies take a step to legally protect themselves by having arbitration overseas. So if they have a problem with their projects in their host country, that problem can be judged in an arbitration court, which is often situated outside of the host country in a major country such as France or the United States. That also brings with it a degree of national protection. How do you think those echoes of realism and those cloaks of nationality, do you think those things I think that's a valid point to mention?
Remember that realism, like all theory, attempts to explain how the world works. So one echo of realism that we may witness in the modern era is the ongoing trend of companies being affiliated with their home countries. From a realist perspective, it might make sense that companies, as an extension of the state, are operating on foreign soil because in some way, shape, or form, especially in the extractive industry, it maximizes the state's interest to have representatives in the country that it's doing business and engaging in international relations with. So that trend is another ongoing echo we see of the realist theory.
Keep in mind that the maximizing and pursuit of national self-interest is not viewed as a good or bad thing in realism. Rather, it's the way that we describe state behavior, which naturally seems to revolve around pursuing self-interest. So it's not considered a bad thing if a state's trying to maximize its interests. Ultimately, that's an extension of the natural behavior that states engage in on a 24/7 basis.
To summarize our discussion for the day, we can conclude that theory is still very young in the international relations world and it continues to evolve. Traditional theories in international relations remain highly influential because of that relative youthfulness, and one of the key concepts of those traditional theories is that they center upon the state's behavior. And we see that in fields like offensive and defensive realism, which respectively argue for the maximization of states' interests and the occasional use of institutions to defend them. Those themes continue to echo today whenever we see processes at the international and legal levels that involve, to some level, state interests.
That's been a great discussion, Jake. I really appreciate that. And we hope it's given our viewers a flavor of the start of international relations theories, which is realism. Realism, I think we agreed, is probably one of the hardest theories that can relate directly to the modern world and especially to industry and mining. But I think what we've tried to do is give you a view of the echoes of realism and that cloak of nationality that companies really feel comfortable in. And I think that does reflect itself in some of the complex issues that we'll study going forward. And next week, we're going to move on to liberalism, which is a theory that has a lot more relevance to the way the world operates today. And it'll be very interesting to dip into that and see exactly what it's got to offer. Jake, thanks very much for your time and stay safe over there in the USA.
I'll try my best and take care of yourself, Mike.